Thank you very much. I'm very pleased there's such a large attendance. Tony reminded me that just at this time, 200 years ago today, Lewis was riding up to Grinder's stand. It was the last day of his life, and it was at dusk. Because this is such a serious topic, I felt that I did need to prepare this as a written statement, but I'll try my best to read it well, and then we can go into questions. It's a 30-minute talk. I would like to thank the Southern Book Festival and Tennessee Humanities Council for inviting me, and Tony for his introduction. Tomorrow will mark the 200th anniversary of Lewis's death. It's one of the most significant and enduring mysteries of American history. Was he murdered, or did he commit suicide, as is commonly believed? 200 years ago today, this was his last day on Earth. He was only 35 years old. He was traveling on the Natchez Trace to Tennessee on his way to Washington, D.C., and had arrived at Grinder's Stand, a roadside inn and tavern located 78 miles from Nashville, where we are today. Sometime during the night, he died of gunshot wounds. Was it suicide or was it murder? After returning from the Lewis and Clark expedition, Lewis was appointed by President Jefferson to become governor of Louisiana Territory. He had moved to St. Louis, the capital of the territory, and was going to Washington to seek reimbursement for bills he had paid personally, bills for printing the territorial laws of Louisiana and other government expenses. Totaling almost $2,500, they were more than his year's salary. He was accompanied by Seaman, his dog, who traveled with him to the Pacific coast and back, and by his servant, John Pernier. Pernier was not a slave. He was a free man of African and French descent. He had been a White House servant while Lewis was serving as Jefferson's private secretary before the expedition. Pernier was present on the night of Lewis's death. He brought the news of his death to Lewis's mother, Lucy Marks, in Charlottesville, and to Presidents Jefferson and Madison. Within 6 months, Pernier would also be dead, supposedly of suicide. He died of an opium overdose while waiting to receive his back pay of $240 from the Lewis estate. We know that Seaman died at Grinder's Stand because a contemporary account said he died of grief at his master's grave. That's all we know, and that's why our book was written. The book presents the evidence for why Meriwether Lewis's remains should be exhumed in order to determine the cause of his death. It also presents historical evidence, some 20 documents pertaining to his death that have never been seen before. They've never been gathered together. The last part of the book is my own theory as to who murdered him and why. My co-author is a distinguished fellow of the Academy of Forensic Science. He is a professor of forensic law and science at George Washington University and has conducted many investigations of mysterious deaths and historical mysteries, including exhuming the remains of Jesse James. Whenever he decides to do an exhumation, he first gets the written consent of family members. Lewis family members wholeheartedly support an exhumation. Starting with Meriwether Lewis's mother, they have always questioned whether his death was a suicide. Over 200 collateral descendants have signed petitions asking for exhumation. They have set up a they've set up a website and hired a public relations firm. Their website is called solvethemystery.org. They are neutral on the subject as to whether it was murder or suicide, and simply want to solve the mystery, as they say. Professor Starrs is also neutral. I, however, believe it was murder. and I make the case for murder in the third section of the book. After the exhumation takes place, the family wants to have a Christian reburial with military honors at the Meriwether Lewis National Monument and Grave Site. The monument and grave site is located on the Natchez Trace Parkway on the site of Grinder's Stand where he met his death. In the early 1990s, Professor Starrs realized an official coroner's inquest had never been held. He contacted Lewis County officials, the county where the monument is located, and suggested holding one. This modern inquest was held in June 1996 and received national and international media attention. However, according to local tradition, there had been an earlier inquest in 1810, but no records have been located. Tradition has it that the local jurors were afraid to charge the innkeeper, Robert Grinder, and one of his relatives, Thomas Runyon, with the murder. Long-lost records may yet turn up. Tony Turnbow, who introduced me, has written a play about the 1810 inquest, which is being performed this weekend in Hohenwald, and which I had the pleasure of seeing a couple of nights ago. The transcript of the 1996 coroner's inquest contains the testimony of 13 expert witnesses, and it takes up the first half of our book. It is the reason for the subtitle, A Historic Crime Scene Investigation, CSI, with Meriwether Lewis. The forensic scientists are very well known in their fields, and that's for real. Those are very big names in their disciplines. They have testified at thousands of court trials and coroner's inquests. All the witnesses volunteered their time and were only paid for travel expenses. Professor Starrs started the testimony to the coroner's jury. 3 historians testified, one for suicide, one for murder, and another examined the state of Lewis's finances. A geologist discussed the geology of the grave site. An expert on the psychology of suicide, a former homicide detective who had investigated over 2,000 deaths, said that in using a psychological profile, he would investigate Lewis's death as a homicide. 2 documents examiners declared that a crucial piece of evidence for the suicide theory, the so-called Russell statement, was a forgery. 2 medical doctors testified about analyzing the path of gunshot wounds. A firearms expert gave a demonstration firing off a .69 caliber black powder pistol, the type of weapon that Lewis was carrying. One expert testified he believed Lewis was suffering from advanced syphilis and had shot himself in a fit of mental derangement. A current biographer thinks that Lewis shot himself because he was in the middle of malarial fevers. And finally, Dr. William Bass testified. He is called the father of forensic anthropology. He founded the world-famous University of Tennessee Forensic Anthropology Lab known as the Body Farm. Maybe it's not a coincidence that the state of Tennessee has pioneered in forensic anthropology, considering the role that the mysterious death of Meriwether Lewis has played in the state's history. At the conclusion of the testimony, the 7 members of the jury delivered their verdict. They asked the National Park Service to exhume the remains of Meriwether Lewis to determine the cause of his death. The Park Service, which has jurisdiction over the monument and grave site, refused to grant permission and blocked subsequent appeals. That's where matters stood until recently, when the family mobilized to try once again to have an exhumation, followed by a Christian reburial with military honors at the gravesite. This year, the family was allowed to submit an application to the Park Service, and currently technical reports are being submitted. When they are in, then there will be a hearing over whether there should be an exhumation. If the Park Service grants permission, then Dr. Hugh Berryman a forensic anthropologist at Middle Tennessee State University, will be in charge of the exhumation. Professor Starrs has DNA samples from the family, and he will write the final report. At the 200th anniversary of the gravesite ceremony that was held earlier this week, the National Park Service announced that a $3 million visitor center will be built at the gravesite, which up to now has been a very lonely place. If an exhumation takes place, what is likely to be discovered? Well, there was a previous exhumation. It took place in 1848, when the state of Tennessee honored Lewis's memory by erecting a monument over the gravesite. In the course of building the monument, his remains were exhumed. Lewis's bones were identified by the presence of square iron nails that had been forged by a local blacksmith to build the coffin. Now we can use DNA to establish that these are his bones. There were 3 members of the Monument Committee. One was a medical doctor. In 1850, the committee submitted their final report to the state legislature. They added a highly provocative statement, making certain that this information became part of the permanent legislative record. They said, "The impression has long prevailed that under the influence of disease of body and mind, of hopes based upon long and valuable services, not merely deferred but wholly disappointed, Governor Lewis perished by his own hands. It seems to be more probable that he died by the hands of an assassin." What could the Monument Committee have seen? Was it a bullet in the back of his head, a bullet hole? That's what the local people reported seeing at the exhumation when they identified the iron nails. We should attempt to find out the truth by conducting a modern scientific exhumation. In 1924, when the state of Tennessee applied for national monument status, they called his death a murder. The letter stated, "Investigations have satisfied the public that he was murdered, presumably for the purpose of robbery." The accounts of his death by suicide, on the other hand, are all second-hand. There are no eyewitness reports. There are 3 stories told by the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Grinder, after Lewis's death, all of which contradict each other. In the first 2 accounts, she says that she heard 2 gunshots on that night. In the 3rd account, told years later, she says that she heard 3 gunshots. The first account was told to Indian agent James Neely, who was escorting Lewis to Nashville. Agent Neely was traveling with Lewis, but he wrote to President Jefferson that he wasn't with him on the night of his death. He said 2 pack horses had strayed away from their camp the night before, and he stayed behind looking for them. He had sent Lewis on ahead with Lewis's servant Pernier and Neely's own servant to Grinder's stand. Agent Neely arrived at Grinder's stand sometime shortly after Lewis's death and arranged for his burial. Neely's letter is the primary evidence for the suicide theory. Oddly enough, President Jefferson never wrote about Lewis's death, except for the introduction he wrote to the Lewis and Clark journals when they were published in 1814. For one of the writingest presidents of all time, he was strangely silent about the death of his friend and protege, as was Lewis's best friend, William Clark. There was no attempt by anyone to investigate Lewis's death or to arrange for his reburial at the family's graveyard in Charlottesville behind the Lewis family home. James Neely plays a mysterious role in these events. He took Lewis's 2 pistols, his rifle, his gold watch, and his horse. Most likely, he also took his money because $100 in cash was missing. Lewis's stepbrother, John Marks, journeyed to Neely's home in 1811 and managed to retrieve Lewis's horse and rifle. but Neely was away from home and had the pistols and watch with him. The second Mrs. Grinder account was written by ornithologist Alexander Wilson, who visited Grinder's stand after Lewis's death. The account has been misstated as having been written in 1811, but in fact it was written in May of 1810, just 6 months after Lewis's death. Wilson, who lived in Philadelphia, was traveling south in search of new birds and seeking subscribers for the first volume of his famous American Ornithology. He was one of Lewis's best friends. Lewis had given him the bird specimens they had collected on the Lewis and Clark expedition to be illustrated for publication. While visiting Grinder's stand, Wilson paid Robert Grinder to put up a fence to protect Lewis's grave from the hogs and wolves, and got his written promise that he would do so. Wilson wrote, "I left this place in a very melancholy mood, which was not much allayed by the prospect of the gloomy and savage wilderness which I was just entering alone." Mrs. Grinder told Alexander Wilson a new version of her story. In this account, she said she saw Lewis crawling around the yard after being shot. In all three accounts, Mrs. Grinder says she spent the night in a kitchen cabin near the cabin where the family lived. The cabin lived in one of 2 log cabins that were joined by a common roof, a style of frontier architecture called a dog trot cabin. Travelers would stay on the other side of the family cabin. The kitchen cabin was several yards away from the double cabin, and Mrs. Grinder stayed there that night with 3 young children, her children, and perhaps a young hired girl. The 2 servants who were accompanying Lewis were staying in the horse barn about 200 yards away. Wilson writes that Mrs. Grinder told him she heard 2 pistol shots from Lewis's cabin, and in a few minutes, she heard him at her door calling out, "Oh, madam, give me some water and heal my wounds." The logs being opened and unplastered, she saw him stagger back and fall against a stump that stands between the kitchen and the room. He crawled some distance and raised himself up by the side of a tree, where he sat for about a minute. It's a very dramatic account, which has often been cited by historians, but however, it's been proven to be false. Professor John Geiss, who has written another book on the death of Meriwether Lewis, researched the phases of the moon for that night. He found out that on the night of October 10th, 11th, 1809, it was the night after a new moon. You could not see anything on the Natchez Trace. It was pitch black. Mrs. Grinder could not have seen what she described. There are other unbelievable aspects to her stories. Mrs. Grinder said that she had to go to the barn to wake up the 2 sleeping servants who slept through the gunfire from 2 pistols at a distance of 200 yards. And what about Seaman? There is no mention of the dog. Anyone who knows the story of Seaman on the expedition knows he would have been barking like crazy, whatever was happening that night. The third account is the most interesting and perhaps the closest to the truth. It was published in a newspaper in 1845. The writer had interviewed Mrs. Grinder in 1838 when she was 57 years old. Robert Grinder had since died, and perhaps then she felt free to tell another version. In this account, she makes 3 new and very different statements. The first one is, right about now, 200 years ago, about dark, 2 or 3 other men rode up and called for lodging. Mr. Lewis immediately drew a brace of pistols, stepped towards them, and challenged them to fight a duel. They, not liking this salutation, rode on to the next house 5 miles. The second statement is that she heard 3 gunshots instead of 2 gunshots. Supposedly, Lewis committed suicide by using each one of his 2 pistols. If instead it was actually 3 pistol shots, then it must have been an assassination. She also said that after his death, Lewis was found to be wearing old and tattered clothing when his body was discovered. His servant, John Pernier, on the morning of Lewis's death, was wearing Lewis's clothes and carrying his gold watch. It seems likely that Lewis and Pernier were planning for Lewis to try to escape his pursuers by having Pernier act as a decoy. There is yet one other separate account called the Russell Statement made in 1811. In this account, Lewis not only shoots himself twice, once in the head and once in the chest, but he is found cutting himself from head to foot with razors before he dies. Historians have generally mixed these accounts together, picking and choosing as they liked. Because the documents have never been published before in their entirety, it was not possible to compare them. But now they are in this book, and you can read them for yourself. The suicide stories on the face of it don't make any sense. How can a career Army officer, an expert marksman, not manage to kill himself with the first shot? The bullets were about the size of 25-cent coins, 69 caliber. What if instead he was shot in the back of the head while trying to escape his assassins? An exhumation will provide the answer. Other evidence in the documents section points to a wider conspiracy and cover-up. In assembling the historical documents for publication, I began to see a pattern of lies or misinformation. If I hadn't put these documents together, it wouldn't have become apparent. The most crucial evidence is the contradiction between the contents of the 2 authentic letters which were written by Captain Gilbert C. Russell to President Jefferson. In January 1810, Captain Russell was the commander of Fort Pickering, where Lewis spent some of the last days of his life. However, there's another statement called the Russell Statement that supposedly was written by him in 1811 and has been used to support the suicide theory. The 2 letters that he did write in January were certified by the documents experts at the coroner's inquest to be authentically written in his handwriting. The Russell Statement was certified to have been neither written nor signed by either Captain Russell or by his witness, Major Jonathan Williams. The most damaging misinformation in the so-called Russell Statement is that Lewis attempted to commit suicide twice while he was on his way to Fort Pickering. It was said that in one of these attempts he almost succeeded, and he was prevented from doing so by the boat crew. This is just simply a lie. It is a key component of the conspiracy cover-up story. The reason we know it's a lie is because of the 2 authentic letters of Captain Russell, which are reports to Jefferson about everything he knows about Lewis's last days. Captain Russell never makes any mention of prior suicide attempts, only in the so-called statement supposedly written by him, identified as a forgery. The authentic letters are detailed reports of Lewis's 2-week stay at the fort, his finances and his possessions left at the fort, and what Russell was told happened to Lewis after he left the fort with Neely. Captain Russell says that if he had been allowed to send his own man with Lewis instead of Neely, Lewis would still be alive because Neely encouraged Lewis's drinking. I question whether that's a true story about the drinking. I don't question it that he would still be alive if he hadn't gone with Neely. Russell writes to Jefferson that this Neely also said he lent the governor money, which cannot be so, as he had none himself, and the governor had more than $100 in notes and specie, besides a check which I let him have of $99.58, none of which it is said could be found. Captain Russell told the president that Lewis had arrived at the fort on September 15th in bad condition, suffering from malarial fevers. Russell said that in about 6 days, Lewis was perfectly restored in every respect and able to travel. He also wrote that Governor Lewis stayed at the fort for an additional 6 to 8 days, expecting that Captain Russell himself would be allowed to travel with him to Washington. Russell had the same problems that Lewis had. His bills were also not being paid by federal bureaucrats. But his commanding officer, General James Wilkinson in New Orleans, denied him permission to travel. William Clark also received letters from Captain Russell after Lewis's death, or he thought he did. But these letters contain the same lies that are part of the conspiracy cover-up stories. Clark wrote to his brother Jonathan on November 26, 1809, quote, "I have just received letters from Captain Russell, who commands at the Chickasaw Bluffs, that Governor Lewis was there detained by him 15 days in a state of derangement most of the time, and that he attempted to kill himself before he got there." Clark also tells his brother that Russell said that Lewis made his will at the bluff and left William Meriwether and myself executors, and directed that I should dispose of his papers. Well, the three lies in the so-called Russell letters to Clark are the prior suicide attempts, the 15 days in a state of mental derangement, and that Lewis had made a will at the fort. William Clark searched for that will and never found it. Other historians have searched. I searched for about a year in every archive I could think of. And finally, when I put these documents together and saw this pattern of conspiracy lies, I realized that there was no will. It was just a clever story that had been put into this letter to make William Clark accept the fact that his best friend had committed suicide. It misled him. And in fact, of course, he was the executor of the estate, and he did take possession of the Lewis and Clark papers. It was an obvious thing that would have happened. So these letters must have been forgeries. There is an authentic will that was written in his small memorandum book. The will left everything to his mother, Lucy Marks, and he had written it in New Madrid on his way down to Fort Pickering. Captain Russell would absolutely have told President Jefferson about a second will written at the fort. He never mentioned it. Again, someone was using Captain Russell's name to spread misinformation. When Clark received these letters, it was part of the cover-up. It helped to persuade him that he had indeed committed suicide. Even though there wasn't a second will, it all happened, as I said. The letters from Russell that Clark thought he received have never been found. Undoubtedly, they were not written by Russell, but by someone else. And who might that be? I suggest General James Wilkinson was behind the plot to assassinate Lewis, and that he wrote the fake Russell letters and Russell statement. He was known to use forgeries during his long career of treachery. Wilkinson is called America's greatest traitor by historians. He was a fifth-generation Marylander who served as a commanding general of the United States Army for many years and was the first governor of Louisiana Territory in 1805. He became a secret agent of the Spanish government in 1787 and was called Agent Number 13. He was a double agent for over 30 years. General Wilkinson died in Mexico City in 1825, working for the Mexican government. In the one short year that Wilkinson was governor of Louisiana Territory in 1805, he created a lot of chaos over corrupt land deals. He was a co-conspirator with Aaron Burr in the 1806 attempt to invade Mexico, but he betrayed Burr and saved himself. Burr was indicted for treason, and Wilkinson narrowly escaped indictment. Meriwether Lewis was present at Burr's trial for treason after he returned from the expedition. Lewis served as Jefferson's eyes and ears at the trial and reported back to him. When Lewis accepted the position of governor of Louisiana Territory, his first responsibility was to root out suspected Burrites from positions of power and influence. Aaron Burr's brother-in-law, Joseph Brown, had been Wilkinson's territorial secretary. The territory was filled with Burrites, and they were determined to get rid of Meriwether Lewis. I present evidence in the book pointing to a new filibuster plot to liberate Mexico and obtain the wealth of its silver mines, and speculate that Lewis must have been carrying information to President Madison about it. There is also the question of the lead mine district south of St. Louis. 10 square miles, it had been reserved as public land by the federal government and was estimated to be worth $15 million, the price of the Louisiana Purchase. Lead was used to make bullets. The Land Claims Board was about to start hearing the cases concerning the large landholders. John Smith T. was an enemy of Lewis. The T stands for Tennessee, by the way. Smith T. had a private army battling Moses Austin for control of the lead mine district, and Lewis was carrying papers relating to the lead mines. After Lewis's death, all the documents he was carrying to Washington were inventoried and neatly tied in bundles. The documents section in our book has that inventory. They were carried to Washington by a Confederate of General Wilkinson's. And when they were received, it was said that they were so badly assorted that no idea could be given them by any means of general description. In other words, his papers had been ransacked. What did Meriwether Lewis accomplish during his term as governor? Lewis was a remarkably good administrator in the 18 months he was in residence. He personally paid for and brought a printing press and printer, a man, to start the first newspaper west of the Missouri. He published the territorial laws. He started the St. Louis Masonic Lodge. He negotiated a major treaty with the Osage Indians. He was a hard-working, honest administrator working under very difficult and challenging circumstances, and he was surrounded by enemies. In May of 1809, Lewis adopted the teenage son of an interpreter, Rene Jessame. Jessame and his family were returning home to the Mandan villages with the Mandan chief Big White. His son, Toussaint, wanted to stay in St. Louis and attend school. Lewis signed indenture papers for Toussaint, agreeing to provide for his education and upkeep for 5 years. Lewis's mother was planning to move to St. Louis the next year. He had purchased a property for her. He was investing in St. Louis real estate. His brother was already living in St. Louis, a partner in the Missouri Fur Company. Meriwether Lewis had a great deal to live for, and the broken shaft of the column on his monument says it all: a life cut short, an untimely death at age 35. Some people feel that he could have become the President of the United States if he had lived. He was, as Jefferson so aptly wrote, of courage undaunted, possessing a firmness and perseverance of purpose which nothing but impossibilities could divert from its direction. We owe it to his memory to try and establish the cause of his death. I'd like to invite you to visit our book's website and sign up for my email newsletter, which I put out about once a month if you want to stay current with developments. Thank you. Now we can have fun and just talk about what is on your minds.
First question. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Step up to the microphone okay.
Why do you think, I mean, Clark had a lot of power later on. Why do you think, if he believed Lewis had been murdered, that he didn't conduct an investigation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a natural one. I think the answer is that General Wilkinson was commanding general of the United States Army, and that would have opened an investigation that nobody wanted to have. It did happen that a month after Lewis's death, General Wilkinson was recalled to Washington to be investigated by 2 congressional committees. One was because almost 1,000 deaths had occurred under his command at New Orleans in 1809. Half of his troops had died of disease. And the other was the charge that he was in the pay of Spain. But both of those congressional hearings drew no conclusions, and instead the whole matter was transferred to a military court, and he stood a court-martial in 1811, and he was absolved. So I would say that it was a very difficult time in American history. We were almost at war with France, with Britain, and with Spain. There were revolutions. The colonial empire of Spain was breaking up. There was a lot of things going on. And people just, it's just too much. He was, you know, the deed had been done.
Other questions?
Yeah.
What evidence is there of any drug and alcohol abuse on the part of Mr. Lewis?
That's a good question. Drug and alcohol abuse, when you look at the documents, the documents in the book make these charges, or you can infer this. But in terms of any earlier record, there is not one iota of evidence. He had a bitter enemy in St. Louis named Frederick Bates. And Bates was not shy about writing letters about how he hated Lewis and how he could do a better job than Lewis, and Lewis should be dismissed from office. He was the territorial secretary of Lewis. It was really very difficult. But Bates, as much as he complained and you know, said that he was an incompetent administrator, never once said that he was neurotic or depressed or an alcoholic or a drug user. Now, what he was suffering from malarial fevers. And malaria is caused by the bite of an infected mosquito, so that you can have it every time you get bitten by an infected mosquito. And routinely, everybody in these areas, in St. Louis, in New Orleans, in Washington, had malaria. They had, it's like we wouldn't talk about having a cold. Well, they didn't talk about malaria. They did use Peruvian bark, which is a kind of quinine, and when you take Peruvian bark, it's bitter. You know, from if you've ever drunk quinine water, it's a bitter taste. Well, this was very bitter. So it was generally taken with liquor. And on the way down river, Lewis was quite sick. He was sick when he left St. Louis. He was carried ashore at New Madrid. He wrote a will. He was drinking. I do believe that. But that was, and he also had a lot of things on his mind. You know, I mean, he was in a very tough circumstance at that point. But in general, no. And Captain Russell said, you know, that he was in perfect health in 6 days. And he said that Lewis swore off hard liquor. And in fact, Lewis left his in the list of possessions, you can see that he left his hard liquor case in a trunk back at the fort. So it was not common for him to drink. But opium was also used for the treatment of malaria. Opium was a standard medical treatment at that time. Yes? Another question? Yes?
What is
Can you just step to the mic? Can you get to that mic?
so do you believe the part about the three men coming to the inn? And if you do, who do you hypothesize that they were?
Well, that's a good question. I've thought about it. You know, the local tradition is that Mr. Grinder and his nephew, I think it is by marriage, committed the murder, the actual murder. But when you look at these documents, you can see a widespread conspiracy. You know, people are telling things, people are writing letters. There's a letter written even before Lewis has left the fort that he had made suicide attempts, which is just not true. So that's proof that in Nashville, all of this has really taken place in Nashville. That, you know, the conspiracy is actively at work. So the three men, if I kind of tend to believe that happened. And I would think they might have been people saying, Lewis, won't you please not bring those documents to Washington? Whatever was on their minds, whatever thing he was going to interfere with their plans with. And I've believed it was Wilkinson who murdered him for many years, because Wilkinson, I'm actually researching the life of General Wilkinson, and boy, does he have a career of treachery and conspiracies that goes back to 1776 and forward. But where was I going with that? Oh, there's two issues. It's the Spanish silver. When I decided to put this book together, I thought, well, I really want to understand 1809. And that took me a year, and I bought a lot of books, and I got a lot of photocopy, just to try to sort out all the different, there's a lot of different books about a lot of different things. And to my surprise, it led to early Texas history. I never expected that I would have to do that. And it's the early filibusters. And it's been a lot of fun. But General Wilkinson was involved with conspiracies to invade Mexico from the 1780s on. It was a constant pursuit. The silver mines of Mexico were what had made the wealth of the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries. It was the 2/3 of the silver of the world was in Mexico. And the King of Spain had been deposed by Napoleon in 1808. Napoleon put his brother on the throne of Spain. So that meant the entire Spanish colonial empire was open for revisiting. Who would they make alliances with? Could England get back in? Could France? Could America? There were independent movements in all of these different countries, like Brazil. It was a time of revolutions. But not many of them had a major source of wealth very close to the American border. And what most people involved in this wanted was to set up a new country. Instead of having one United States going across the whole continent, they envisioned 2 countries. And Aaron Burr hoped to be the emperor of the new country. Yeah? You got a question? Yeah?
How did General Wilkinson meet his demise? I hope it was painful.
Yeah, Wilkinson suffered a lot of illness, and supposedly he died of an opium overdose in Mexico. Oh. He was a remarkable man, and he actually did many good things for America during his career, mostly consisting of betraying conspiracies. He betrayed a lot of conspiracies, which did help us because it kept us unified. And I think that if he felt sufficiently motivated, he would have killed Lewis to preserve his own career. And at the time, there was a new book out called Proofs of the Corruption of General James Wilkinson, published in September 1809 by his former good friend. A lot of people were trying to disassociate themselves from Wilkinson by writing books about how bad Wilkinson was and how they really had nothing to do with him. So that was Daniel Clark, the richest man in New Orleans. And that was the basis for one of those congressional hearings. There was an organization in New Orleans called the Mexican Association, and it had 350 members. And their purpose was to liberate Mexico. And they were Americans. But the French were also active, and the British were. It was a time of turmoil. We won't know for sure about anything until we establish whether he was murdered or not. But if he was, and I think we would find that if he was exhumed, because according to the reports in 1848, there was a very big hole in the back of his head. And I think that that deserves investigation. What bothers me, I don't mind suicide, you know, and I don't mind somebody being called bipolar or something, but I mind it if you don't say how many wonderful things he accomplished. You can say, oh, he was depressed, he was alcoholic, he was bipolar, but he also managed to start a newspaper, start a Masonic lodge, publish the territorial laws, you know, and function very effectively. But they don't do that. They say, no, he was lazy or he was out of it. And it's just not true. He was thrown into a very dangerous situation, and he knew it. And he left the territory in the most perfect state of tranquility it had ever been in, is what he wrote at the end of his life. So, yeah.
Why do you suppose the Park Service refused to exhume the body earlier?
Well, maybe 200th anniversary is a charm.
Reason given?
Well, no, they don't say it that way. No, they never said a reason. Do you know, Tony? Was there a reason given?
They said they had a duty because the grave is located on national park property, they have a duty to protect the grave as an historical artifact. And they do not want to begin a precedent of exhuming bodies, although that precedent, I believe, has been established in Arlington. But that's the reason they give.
I read somewhere, I think when the anniversary of the expedition started, that there were some people who thought the Park Service isn't really sure his body's there. That's one reason they don't want to exhume
right.
it.
But Tony and I were talking about that earlier. First of all, you can see this on the web, on the genealogy sections for these family members, the Coopers, the Blacksmith family, and other local people. And they have the documents from that time. They said they saw this giant hole in the back of the skull. They said they identified the iron nails. You know, they undoubtedly determined it was Lewis's remains. Well, if they're going to the trouble of building a great big giant monument over his remains, they wouldn't just, you know, they would do something very special to maintain them under the monument. And we expect that we will find that out. or we hope so. That's the other thing. Lewis never had a ceremony. And he never, a burial ceremony. And he never had the chance to be reburied at the family graveyard. And it finally occurred to me, thinking about this, well, they couldn't afford to dig him up and rebury him because they would have seen things that they didn't want to deal with. So that may explain the mysterious silence of everyone, that they just did not want to get into that he was murdered, and it had happened. William Clark never wrote anything about it, but there is a family report that he did say in later life that he thought it was murder. And William Clark's son, who was named Meriwether Lewis Clark, wrote to the Monument Committee, and he said, "Have you heard the story that Governor Lewis was murdered?" He said, "I'd like to clear the reputation of Governor Lewis, if possible."
This is slightly off subject, but have you heard anything or done any research about the Zebulon Pike expedition being a precursor?
It's in the book.
Was that a precursor to an invasion?
Yes.
It was?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Wait till you read my Burr conspiracy section. I had a lot of fun teasing that out. It's very interesting. And of course, that's General Wilkinson. At the same time that the Lewis and Clark expedition is returning home in 1806, there's several expeditions unauthorized sent out by General Wilkinson, including Zebulon Pike. And it's all for the purpose of, they wanted to take Texas and maybe Mexico. And I shouldn't try to get into that whole Zebulon Pike story, but you'll be fascinated. It has to do with Captain Herrera, who, remember when we're almost at war with Spain, and Wilkinson and the Mexican Colonel Herrera make a private agreement to establish a neutral ground between Spanish territory and American territory. That's where every pirate and scoundrel and filibuster stays for the next 15 or 20 years. It's a staging ground for invasions. But anyway, the same colonel that made the agreement with General Wilkinson, he's the one who hosted Zebulon Pike at his house when Zebulon Pike was captured, supposedly. And Pike writes about it in his journal. And he said that Colonel Herrera said that he was very worried about making that private agreement, but then he was congratulated by his superior officers for disobeying their orders. And what it was about, in my opinion, is that Aaron Burr was working with the French at this time, French revolutionaries, and that French revolutionaries were in Mexico, and that they were in on a French-connected plot. So you see, Wilkinson did us all a favor by busting Aaron Burr. That's he really did bust many conspiracies. So he's just a very difficult, complicated man. But I think in this case, the stars weren't right for Meriwether Lewis. He had too much going on against him, and they really did want him out of the way. They wanted him to leave St. Louis, I think. They wouldn't have murdered him if he just would have gone away. They just didn't want him interfering with all their plans.
We're out of time. Kira will be signing books following this event out in the colonnade.